This is about 45 minutes.
Thank you and welcome this morning to AIPAC in Depth. Thank you, Jim Woolsey, Idel Nehushtan, Jane Harman, and Robert Satloff for joining us today. Our issues today are vast and numerous. It is quite a horizon. I want to jump right into the discussion. Foremost on everyone's mind is the issue of Iran. Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, recently said that Iran today has enough fissile material, enough low-enriched uranium, that if processed, they could produce one nuclear bomb. Some Iranian leaders in the past have said that Israel is a one-bomb nation. That is, it would only take one nuclear bomb to wipe out Israel and preclude it from any sort of reprisal against Iran. President Obama has said that preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear capability is a priority. And yet it's not entirely clear what the strategy is. There have been two approaches suggested. One is President Obama's proposal for direct engagement with the Iranians. Just recently in March, he issued a statement to the Iranian leadership. Let's take a listen.
My administration is now committed to diplomacy that addresses the full range of issues before us and to pursuing constructive ties among the United States, Iran, and the international community. This process will not be advanced by threats. We seek instead engagement that is honest and grounded in mutual respect.
And yet, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates has said that this sort of direct engagement would only work best if accompanied by economic sanctions. He recently gave an interview in which he said, perhaps if there is enough economic pressure placed on Iran, diplomacy can provide them an open door through which they can walk if they choose to change their policies. I think the two go hand in hand, but I think what gets them to the table is economic sanctions. So Jim Woolsey, you are a longtime observer of this region. Are sanctions and diplomatic engagement compatible as a strategy, or do they undermine one another?
Well, every president since Jimmy Carter has tried diplomatic engagement with the Iranians, and it has brought only delay. The Persians invented chess, and they're playing it well. They have these pawns called Hezbollah and Hamas and Syria that they move around in order to protect the pawn that's headed down toward the King's Row to become lethal, namely their nuclear weapons program. And I don't think there's any way that we will have any chance of success in dealing with them without damaging them very severely economically. And the only way I can think of to do that is to work with like-minded countries, and if other countries don't want to play, they don't want to play. We need to cut off their imports of refined petroleum products. Ahmadinejad is part of a cult called the Hojatiyya that's headed by an Ayatollah named Mesbah Yazdi. He was exiled to Qum by the Holy City by Khomeini because Khomeini thought he was too radical. This is Ahmadinejad's mentor. We are not going to succeed just talking to Iran.
Jane Harman, you have worked on the issues of sanctions in the past. As Jim Woolsey alluded to, Iran imports 40% of its petroleum products, of its gasoline and petrol, which is an amazing notion for an oil-producing country. Its economy is apparently in dire straits. Oil prices are at record lows. Is Iran especially vulnerable today to some form of economic sanctions?
Absolutely. Let me say that it's been 20 years or so that Congress has tried sanctions. We haven't done as well as I would hope, but in the 90s, John Kyle and I coordinated an effort in the Senate and the House to block the Russians from helping Iran's missile industry. Would that we had succeeded. Congress has ramped up sanctions on a bipartisan basis. Now there are new bills introduced by Evan Bayh in the Senate and Howard Berman in the House to block the import of refined petroleum products. This is where Iran is particularly vulnerable, especially now that oil is low. And I think our goal must be to have a limited window for one more diplomatic effort, Jim, in my view, but to do it from a point of strength. And our point of strength is to ramp up U.S. Economic sanctions and work with the world community, those who will cooperate, but especially try to get China, which uses Iran as a gas tank, to cooperate, because this is in China's interest to ramp up worldwide sanctions at the same time. If this window closes and we have tried everything else, I favor leaving the military option on the table as a last resort.
General Nehushtan, I want to lift the lens up a little bit and look at the region and the changing dynamic in the region. The government of Morocco has cut off all diplomatic ties with Iran. Relations between the government of Bahrain and the government of Iran have soured. Egypt, the government of Egypt refused to participate in a recent Arab summit because Iran was attending. You and I were talking in the green room earlier this morning about just how much the broader conflict facing Israel and the threats facing Israel are dramatically different from what we have known for the last 40, 50, or 60 years. How can Israel and the United States channel that changing dynamic and the potential changing nature or intentions of some of these Arab governments?
First of all, true, it's, if there is one message for me to hear, is that the Middle East is in a process of change. Three dimensions of change. The nuclearization process of Iran is absolutely a major force in applying this change. Now, the emergence of radical forces is absolutely a change. Look at the Middle East 10 years ago and now. What do you see now? Hamas and Hezbollah, like in armies, states within the states, even occupied states with their own agenda, driven by extreme ideology. And then the change of nature of wars is happening. And we on the field have to deal with it day by day. So the change is there. Now, imagine how would the Middle East look with a nuclear Iran. Just have the vision. A couple of years from now, I don't know when, but a nuclear Iran in the Middle East. What would the implication be on moderate countries? Would they capitulate? Would they fight? Would they acquire their own nuclear weapon? How would it affect on the peace treaties? You know, the Middle East is probably the most invested in stabilization efforts in the world. You invest all the time, all the efforts just to stabilize. And this is the destabilization process ever, the greatest one. How will it affect on Israel? Iran is conducting a war against Israel vis-a-vis proxies all the time. We fight against their munition, their know-how, their money, and their organizations in the field. So indeed, this reality of nuclear Iran is something that is of great concern to the Middle East, not only to Israel, I believe to the world.
Well, Robert Satloff, that's an important point. You look at countries like Russia and China and many of the European nations, there seems to be a reticence about working with the United States in trying to isolate Iran. If you look at this map here and look at the missile range, potentially nuclear missile range, within which Iran reaches a number of these global powers that don't seem to be working with us in trying to address the Iranian nuclear threat. What is motivating countries like China and Russia, and what can we do to turn them to more constructive partners in this front?
Well, first, Dan, your point is absolutely right. The Iran problem is not just an Israel problem, and it is a grave mistake to suggest that this is only Israel's issue. The Iran problem is a problem for states throughout the Middle East and states throughout the world. And it is absolutely essential that we place this high enough on our priority with every discussion that our president has with leaders throughout Europe, Russia, and China, because if it's number 6 or 7, then it doesn't get heard. But we need to make it right up there, number 1 or 2. We need the Europeans to be very tough with us in our negotiations. We need them to understand that the alternative is not acquiescence to Iran's nuclear weapon, but the alternative to being tough now is probably war. So if you don't want war, you need to be very tough economically and in negotiations now. The alternative cannot be acquiescence to Iran's nuclear ambitions. With the Russians and the Chinese, we need to be very tough with our Arab allies who have assets. We need to ask the Saudis, go to the Chinese They need to make a choice. Who is your energy partner? Is your energy partner going to be Iran, or is it going to be us? You choose. There's enough excess capacity now, given world oil markets, that now is especially the moment that we can turn this spigot tight.
I want to, Jane Harman, I want to pick up on something that Jim Woolsey said earlier about who is in fact in charge in Iran. And there are elections coming up for president in Iran in June that observers are trying to sort of read between the lines and see whether or not it's going to be Ahmadinejad or potentially some moderate. And as Jim alluded to, people like the Supreme Leader are really in control, Ali Khamenei. I want to read a quote by one Iran expert who wrote in The Guardian last March, Mehdi Khalaji. He wrote, "Unfortunately, the most likely outcome of the election will be continuing transformation of the Islamic Republic from a civil government into a garrison state in which the military plays a major role in determining political and economic matters." Is this truly the likely outcome of the Iranian presidential election, regardless of who is elected? And how should we therefore think about U.S. policy in response?
I think it is a possible outcome, but I think there is actually more going on inside Iran than that question implies. For one thing, the Persian population in Iran is not a majority. It is a plurality. There are many different, diverse and disagreeing populations inside Iran. And an obvious strategy, which I believe is a very good strategy, is to work to separate those populations. Second of all, the economy of Iran is in pretty bad shape. That is why increased sanctions, and especially sanctions on refined petroleum products, goes for the jugular of the military and elected and religious leadership of Iran. So let's factor that in. As President Obama has said, and I agree, we are not at war with the Iranian people. And they would like, I think most of them would like, a very different government. So who's in charge? I do think the religious leadership is in charge. And those are the folks, if we have a negotiation, that we have to talk to. Ahmadinejad is a hothead. Of course, his remarks to me, the daughter of a refugee from Nazi Germany, are personally and profoundly offensive. But getting past that, to trying to be pragmatic, thinking about a way to stop this nuclear bomb problem, I think we should be talking to the religious leadership of the country and working to separate the population of the country so that it can hopefully increasingly resist the kind of terrible leadership it has.
We have a lot to get to. We have to take a short commercial break to hear from our sponsor. Stay seated. Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian territories right after this message.
Susie, did the AIPAC group arrive yet?
Sorry, not yet, sir.
Don't keep your member of Congress waiting. On May 5th, keep your appointments. If you want to keep your relationships.
Are they here yet?
And welcome back to AIPAC in Depth. We are here with our distinguished panel of experts. General Nehushtan, I want to move to Lebanon, which is, needless to say, intricately connected to all these issues we're talking about today. In summer of 2006, the war in Lebanon was supposed to dramatically diminish the threat from Hezbollah. Today, if we can pull up this map, Hezbollah's missile arsenal has literally tripled from about 15,000 to 42,000. Spread throughout southern Lebanon. And there are reports that Hezbollah's missile reach can reach as far south into Israel as to be within reach of Beersheba. In light of that and your current portfolio, how do you think about the threat from Hezbollah, and where does it fit into the list of priorities given all that's on your plate?
First of all, Hezbollah is indeed one example of the change in the Middle East in terms that terror organizations have taken over the country. and operates under a logic of a terror organization with a capacity of a military power. It has a big army. Now this army doesn't come from the air. It comes from its supporters. Hezbollah is actually being supported by two governments, Syria and Iran, and halfly by Lebanon, because it's Lebanese. And it's building the force since the 2006 war tremendously. Yes, we are aware of that. For the time being, they are deterred. It's quiet. But the capacity is there. And it's very dependent upon, contingencies and other possible events, whether or not it stays like that. And we are aware, because this reflects indeed the change that I mentioned about the nature of wars. Now, what's the idea of the Hezbollah? And the Hamas, by the way, that have duplicated everything. It's all about rockets and missiles from within civilians against civilians. This is it. It's a very simple equation and very difficult to break if we operate with an army, a modern army that operates like within a normal code of operation. And the challenge is there, and much of the change of the nature of wars has to do with what we do and develop, like missile defense programs, which are very important in that respect, and all the other issues that has to do with supreme intelligence and precision-guided munitions. And the wars tend to be more expensive, more difficult, yet we can confront that, and we are doing any effort every day to do that.
Jim, it's not just a growing military power, Hezbollah. There's also a changing and growing political power. Hezbollah now effectively has veto power within, not just effectively, formally has veto power in the Sinora government, in the Lebanese government, under an agreement reached with the Lebanese government. They have ministers in the Lebanese government. There are parliamentary elections in June. I spoke to one analyst at the American University in Beirut who said not only does he expect Hezbollah to gain seats in the Lebanese parliament in June, but they could in fact win a majority in the parliament. So they cease being just some shadowy proxy terrorist organization and actually being a bona fide political organization of a sovereign nation. How does that factor into what General Nehushtan was just speaking to on the military side?
Well, I'd say rather than a political organization, I'd say a totalitarian organization. They are like the Nazi Party in Germany in the early 1930s. They are theocratic, totalitarian, genocidal maniacs. That doesn't mean they're not clever. Hitler was a very clever manipulator of opinion and governments in the 1930s in Europe. You don't just because your objective is hideous doesn't mean that you are clumsy. Hezbollah is a very shrewd enemy. We're not going to make progress against Hezbollah and Hamas and Syria and Iran until we break the economic power that is behind all of that, and that economic power is oil. Bernard Lewis, I think, said 2 or 3 years ago that the 22 states of the Arab League plus Iran have a population approximating that of the U.S. and Canada together. Other than hydrocarbons, almost all oil, those 23 countries export to the world less than Finland, which is a country of 5 million people. Their entire economies, directly or indirectly, depend on oil. And we need to do what my sometime co-author Ann Coren calls turning oil into salt. We need to do to oil what electricity and refrigeration did to salt at the end of the 19th century. It mattered up until around 1900 whether your country had salt mines. Countries went to war over salt mines. It was the only way to preserve meat. It was a very big deal. Refrigeration technology changed that radically and quickly, and salt will be on our lunch table today. Does anybody know where it will come from? Do you care? Are we salt independent? Does anybody care? Of course not. It's just a useful commodity that's bought and sold in international commerce, but nobody lords it over his neighbor. Nobody funds terrorist organizations like Hezbollah because he has access to salt mines. We have to do that to oil. We have to destroy its monopoly.
Go ahead, Jane.
First of all, I strongly agree. Second of all, I think a key to that is in something Robert Satloff said before, which is now, for the first time, many Arab states fear what they call the Shia Crescent. And there is an alignment of interest against Iran. I thought it was meaningful a few weeks ago that Morocco broke off diplomatic relationships with Iran. And I think it is very meaningful that Egyptian President Mubarak is furious about the presence of Hezbollah in Egypt, trying to destabilize tourist sites and to help with the devious imports of more armament into Gaza. So I think you just add them up. Morocco, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, which is absolutely furious, Bahrain, UAE, Jordan. King Abdullah was here just a week ago talking about this. Put that alignment of interest together. Some of these countries produce oil, some don't. And I think the opportunity for us to finally produce a juggernaut around the neck of oil is there, and this is the time to move.
But in terms of countries that we can work with, the $64,000 question is often Syria. There were 4 rounds last year of indirect talks that Turkey facilitated between the Israelis and the Syrians. Senator John Kerry, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made one of his first trips as chairman was to Damascus to meet with President Assad. The Obama administration has sent over 2 envoys recently to meet with senior officials in the Syrian government. Rob, can Syria be flipped? Can Syria be taken away from the Iranian sphere and start to work with us and other more moderate Arab governments, some of the ones that Jane cited, in pursuit of isolating Iran?
This is the new paradigm. Instead of people talking about land for peace, they talk about land for Syria's strategic realignment away from Iran and toward the West. I wish that it were that simple. The Syrians have so far given zero indication of a willingness to go down this route. Let me just say a word about this. When this alignment started in 1980 in the Iran-Iraq War, Iran needed Syria a lot more than Syria needed Iran. Today, that entire equation has changed. Today, Syria needs Iran a lot more than Iran needs Syria. The fact that Syria relies upon Iran as one of its sole assets, as its vehicle for getting from the North Koreans nuclear technology with which to build their own nuclear weapon. Thankfully, some of our friends took care of that a couple of years ago. But there is no evidence. And the question that you posed to Jim a moment ago, what happens if Hezbollah wins? If Hezbollah wins politically in the Lebanese elections, just imagine the implications for Syria. Syrians will become insufferable. Their allies will have won in a state. The idea that Syria would then contemplate throwing away a 25-year political alliance that seems to be moving in a positive direction, I think is very small. And the Syrian leader said so when he said in an interview a couple of weeks ago, if the Israelis want a piece of paper, I'll give them a piece of paper, and we will call that peace. But if they want real peace, trade, cultural relations, all the things that make peace real, then that will wait for everybody else to make peace, and the idea that we are going to realign ourselves is foolish. So we shouldn't be under any such false impressions about where the Syrians are heading.
General.
Yes, just to add on that, mind you, Syria is still the capital of all headquarters for all the Palestinian and other terror organizations, like I think no other country in the world. All Hamas and Jihad and all the others, they're operating from within the capital of Syria. And the support and supply coming to Hezbollah from Iran and from Syria itself into Lebanon to Hezbollah, the cooperation is the strongest ever and growing as ever. So through flipping or not flipping, but the reality is there, and these are the facts, as of now.
Jim, the Palestinian equation. Hamas is in effective control of Gaza Strip. President Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, is in effective control of the West Bank. It is hope, a goal, an objective of U.S. policymakers that President Abbas and the Fatah become the dominant player throughout all the territories. There was an effort recently by Hosni Mubarak in Egypt to actually create some sort of unity government between Hamas and Fatah. Now, U.S. policy officially is opposed to that. Let's take a listen to Secretary Clinton on this subject.
The United States supports the Palestinian Authority as the only legitimate government of the Palestinian people and as a partner on the road to a comprehensive peace, which includes a two-state solution.
So, Jim Woolsey, what would the implications be for the West and for Israel and for the region if Hamas and Fatah managed to form some sort of unity government?
I think that would be very bad because I believe Hamas would, the Palestinian Authority is no great entity from the point of view of peace with Israel, but it's at least not as fanatic as Hamas. And I would be quite concerned about Hamas's attitudes. Let's say, the educational materials, for example, are bad enough in the West Bank. They're Saudi prepared, and they are quite awful from the point of view of prejudice against Israel and Jews and everybody else. But Hamas's materials and teachings kind of go the protocols of the elders of Zion one better. From their point of view, from their doctrinal statements, Jews were responsible for starting both World War I and World War II. World War I in order to destroy the Ottoman Caliphate, World War II because they were arms merchants. I mean, that's Hamas doctrine. This is like trying to have a unity government with Nazis.
Dan?
Yes, Jane, go ahead.
Well, I think our goal is and needs to be to make the Palestinian Authority and Fatah a more capable partner for peace. I think everyone would agree that Salam Fayyad is a very capable partner for peace, but he doesn't have an adequate political model citizen, and there isn't a deep bench there. So I think our goal should be to strengthen his hand and build more leadership. I just want to salute a development that I have seen twice this year. I've made 24 trips to the region as a member of Congress, and 2 of them are this calendar year. I was in the West Bank twice, in Jericho, seeing the progress made under U.S. General Keith Dayton's program, aided by the Jordanians, to strengthen the Palestinian Security Force. There now is a 1,000-man force countrywide and a presidential guard, which kept peace on the West Bank during the Gaza incursion, and also, I was told, have gone into some of the refugee camps around Ramallah for the first time in 20 years. No one has gone into those camps to round up what they call criminals and terrorists. This is a building block, bottom-up building block, to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. And Prime Minister Netanyahu agrees. He thinks that, I've talked to him twice this year, that there may be room now to let the Palestinians handle security not just in Jericho, which is peaceful, but in Jenin and Hebron. So I just want to say that there's more we can do, the U.S., there's more Israel can do, and there's more that the Arab neighborhood can do to create a capable partner for peace. I think Israel's survival as a Jewish state depends on, at some point, the formation of a Palestinian state living in peace side by side with the Jewish state of Israel.
Rob.
First, I want to echo what Representative Harman just said. I think it is absolutely essential that we do what we can to support the moderate forces in the Palestinian Authority. The key strategy has got to be to compel Palestinians to make a choice. The choice is either unity or progress. You can't have unity and progress toward peace. You can't have one big tent that goes from Islamic Jihad on one hand to the Al-Aqsa martyr brigades of Fatah on the other hand, and assume that that tent is going to make peace with Israel. They have to make a choice. This is the same choice that Zionists have always had to make about peace. I mean, we recognize that Israel is a democracy. In Israel, the Knesset votes. Sometimes they vote 61-59 on agreements with the Palestinians. We don't insist that they have 120 votes to make peace with the Palestinians. We shouldn't expect, when Palestinians come to us and say unity is so important, we should come back to them and say no. Make a choice. Leadership is important. Not unity, leadership. That's what matters about the decision to make peace.
You know, all these issues become so complex. Jane, in addition to your trips to Israel over the last couple of years, I know you just returned from Pakistan and Afghanistan. I've been attending AIPAC conferences for a number of years. I've never had to talk about Pakistan, and yet here we are in a situation, very volatile country in the Islamic world. The Taliban is strengthening its hold on Waziristan. Relations between the Pakistani government and India aren't getting any better. We have a very weak government, the Pakistani government in Islamabad, and oh, by the way, it happens to be a nuclear power. Can you just quickly share your observations from your recent trip and how this fits into the broader discussion?
Well, if you really wanted to be depressed, go to Pakistan. The Taliban is not just strengthening its hold on Waziristan, which is its western border with Afghanistan. It's strengthening its hold on Pakistan. It's moving east. And these news reports that it's within 60 miles of Islamabad are true. That doesn't mean it will conquer the whole state, but it could. The government and even the out-of-power folks who want to be part of the government are not as strong as they need to be. And certainly the army is not as skilled as it must be in counterterrorism tactics to defeat the Taliban in their own country. I was stunned when the Secretary of Defense of Pakistan told me, no kidding, listen up folks, that having Sharia law in the Swat Valley was no big deal. All it means is changing the names of a few courts.
Wow.
And so I asked about the flogging of the 17-year-old young woman, and he said, it's not clear that happened. Well, I don't know about you, but I saw it on YouTube. So at any rate, they're in denial. They're focused on India, and oh, they have 60 to 100 nukes. Iran is a problem for the next several years. Pakistan is a problem for the next 6 months. And if you want to talk about nukes in the hands of bad guys, the bad guys live there. So our government assures me that we are protecting Iran's nuclear facility. Pakistan's nuclear facilities, and that A.Q. Khan, whom I worry about still, who's no longer under house arrest, is in check. But I worry a lot about Pakistan, and I do think on the list of problems, Iran, we've got to do Iran, Pakistan, Iran.
We are running out of time. I just want to do a rapid-fire wrap-up here. I'll start with you, Jim Woolsey. It's sort of an open-ended projection or prediction. When we meet next year at AIPAC's policy conference in 2010 and we are assessing the region, what will we be talking about?
Pakistan and Iran. I think that the Iranian leadership, again, fueled by oil, of the Shiite circle and of some supporters in Arab states, is going to dominate the strategic concerns in the Middle East for a long time. And even if Iran is, let's say, at that point, not quite having assembled a nuclear weapon, even if it is still on the verge, as they are today, that prospective nuclear weapon vastly enhances their authority and power in the area, and we can't let that happen.
General Nehushtan, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but...
Never say anything intelligent about the future, but if you look 10 years ago, nothing that happens today was foreseen then. But I think that the major process of change in the Middle East can be visualized as two trains that are now leaving the station, maybe left the station, but can be still called back. The radicals, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, driven by the ideology and power, and the moderate train. And we should and we can work very hard that the right train arrives before the other. I hope that we have good news next week, next year in the AIPAC conference, but there is a lot to be done over there, and the change is significant. We should be prepared.
Robert Satloff.
Dan, I hope I don't send this audience into the wrong direction by answering your question with a sobering note. What I really worry about when we meet here next year is the potential for a deep disagreement between the United States and Israel about how one really deals with an Iranian nuclear challenge that economics, politics, and engagement will not have dealt with. And I fear, Dan, that with the best of intentions and with all desire to end this problem, I fear that if we and the Israelis are not totally on the same page from A to Z on this issue, that next year, if not handled properly, we may be dealing with the most serious face-to-face disagreement between the United States and Israel in the 61-year history of the relationship.
Jane Harman, on that upbeat note.
Well, if I were not an optimist, I wouldn't stay in politics, and I have to say my optimism has been tested in recent weeks. But when I... Thank you. Okay. It ain't over yet. Clap next year. Optimism is about Dan's new baby, Asher. Optimism is about, and our future is about, my oldest grandchild, Lucy Asher Peck. Yes, I know, one of the 12
We didn't
tribes.
coordinate it. We didn't coordinate names.
But it is about our children and our grandchildren, and the future that we try to shape is for them and for Israel's children and grandchildren and for Saudi Arabia's and Morocco's and the world's children and grandchildren. And there is more common interest, I think, than we sometimes remember. But to shape the future, we have to get the present right. And I want to say a couple things in seriousness. I want to waddle into a little conversation for a minute about the present. First, I never thought as a Democrat that I would recommend the Wall Street Journal editorial page, but read yesterday's. Second, I have written a letter to the new Attorney General, Eric Holder, urging him to fully disclose any information, any intercepts, anything that he has bearing on my alleged situation. I want it all out there. I want it in public. I want everyone to understand, including me, what has happened. That's number two. Number three, for those of you who've known me a long time, like Wolsey, you will recall in another century, I was the chief counsel and staff director of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, working for California Senator John Tunney. I know about the Constitution. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in the Fourth Amendment, and I have never, ever supported warrantless wiretaps on Americans, nor would I. And finally, this issue is obviously creating a chilling effect on hardworking, bipartisan members of Congress who care intensely about the U.S.-Israel security relationship and have every right to talk to advocacy groups and our good friends about that relationship. And so, as Sidney Harman, who's sitting in the audience today, would tell you, his wife is not a victim, but his wife is a warrior on behalf of our Constitution and against abuse of power, and I will not quit on this until I am absolutely sure that this never can happen to anyone else. So, on that note, thank you. And with great love for all of you who try so hard to keep America's values and keep America's faith, and in addition to that, keep Israel safe, I want to say that at next year's conference, Asher Senor will be walking, and brilliant, of course he will, and the rest of us old folks will be sitting around here or sitting in the audience, and I think, Rob, I think we will actually be celebrating progress, maybe the success of the diplomatic initiative, I surely hope so, but progress on a worldwide basis in promoting the security of the Jewish state and development and progress and the end of totalitarianism in the Arab region surrounding the Jewish state.
General Nehushtan, you get the last word.
I come from a small country in the Middle East, you're well aware of. Less than 3% of area, less than 0.5% of the population. Last week we had the 61st anniversary for our independence. Against all odds, it's time for reflection. We did good. But looking around, we have great dangers. The need for a strong IDF, a strong Israeli Air Force is ever so important. And with the support of the United States, as we have so many years, I think that the people, the citizens of Israel should be grateful to you as well. And I'm sure that with this support we can do at least 600 years more of happy living in the Middle East. Thank you so much.
General Nehushtan, Jim Woolsey, Jane Harman, Robert Satloff, thank you for an illuminating discussion. That's all for all of us. If it's Sunday at the AIPAC conference, it's AIPAC in Depth. Have a good day.
This has been AIPAC in Depth with Dan Senor, a production of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.